There was a time when the most sacred place in the world was not a battlefield, not a palace, but a temple bedroom, a place where silence weighed heavier than stone, where incense masked fear, where devotion was measured not in prayer, but in obedience of the body. These acts were called holy. They were recorded as blessings, and those who endured them were never allowed to speak. Tonight, we enter the temple's history tried to cleanse, not to shock, but to remember what was erased. Because when sex became sacred, power became absolute. Long before empires crowned kings, before laws were carved by men, divinity often wore a woman's face. Across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and the ancient Mediterranean, goddesses ruled fertility, war, birth, death, and desire. Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, Cybele, they were not gentle symbols, they were forces, and their temples were not merely places of worship. They were engines of political control, economic power, and social fear. To serve the goddess was to serve the state. To disobey was to invite divine punishment. Ancient texts never used the word abuse. They used words like offering, union, blessing. But language has always been power's sharpest weapon. In temple doctrine, the goddess required physical devotion. To refuse was to deny fertility to the land, to deny favor to the city, to invite famine, miscarriage, defeat. Fear did the rest. Women, often young, often chosen by family or decree, were dedicated to the temple. Once inside, they belonged not to themselves, but to the goddess's earthly representatives. And the records are careful, too careful. They describe ceremonies, not emotions, outcomes, not costs. In Sumer and Babylon, the goddess Inanna, later Ishtar, ruled love, fertility, and war. She did not ask, she demanded. The sacred marriage ritual united a high priestess with the king himself. On the surface, it symbolized cosmic harmony, order restored, harvest secured. But symbolism does not erase reality. The priestess was expected to embody the goddess, to perform perfection, to remain silent. What she felt was irrelevant. What mattered was what the crowd believed. Most temple women are unnamed in history. They appear as numbers, as offerings, as functions. Daughters given to temples ensured family protection. Refusal was dangerous. Acceptance was praised. And once dedicated, leaving was almost impossible. Silence became survival. If you're drawn to the darker truths of history, subscribe to Boring Histories, where the past is never boring and never clean. This was not one culture, not one goddess, not one city. From Corinth to Carthage, from Anatolia to the Nile, the same pattern appears: divine justification, human silence, absolute authority. When gods demand obedience, men decide what obedience looks like. Later historians, mostly men, cleaned the language. Ritual became romance. Control became devotion. Suffering became symbolism. Victims vanished behind myth, because admitting the truth meant admitting that civilization itself was built on fear. These temples were not anomalies, they were foundations. And in the next part, we descend deeper into Greece, Rome, and Anatolia, where sacred devotion and state power became inseparable, and where the cost was paid quietly by those history chose not to remember. Greece remembered itself as the birthplace of philosophy, reason, and democracy. But long before marble statues softened the past, Greek temples were places of obedience, not debate. Here, desire was refined into myth. Pain was hidden beneath poetry, and exploitation was dressed as beauty. At the heart of it stood a goddess whose smile history never questioned: Aphrodite. Aphrodite was not merely love. She was compulsion. She bent gods and mortals alike. Wars began because she willed it. Cities feared her neglect, and in her temples, desire was not personal, it was political. To serve Aphrodite was to surrender the self. No place embodied this more than Corinth, a wealthy port, a crossroads of trade, and home to one of the most infamous temples in the ancient world. Ancient writers described thousands of temple servants dedicated to Aphrodite. They spoke casually, almost proudly, but numbers erase faces. Classical texts celebrate prosperity. They note increased wealth. They admire devotion. They never describe the nights. They never describe the fear of refusal, the impossibility of escape. The knowledge that the goddesses will spoken by men was final, because to admit coercion would mean admitting that piety and power had fused into a single weapon. Greek society was precise about roles. Citizens spoke, women endured. Temple dedication offered status but removed agency. Once chosen, identity dissolved. History remembers Aphrodite's lovers. It forgets her servants. Rome did not destroy Greek ritual. Rome absorbed it. Where Greece mythologized, Rome regulated. They took sacred devotion and placed it under law. Aphrodite became Venus, still beautiful, still divine, but now supervised. Rome understood something essential. Control faith, and you control people. Temples became institutions. Priestesses became assets. Rome recorded everything. Contracts, duties, vows. The language changed, but the imbalance did not. Consent written by authority is not consent freely given. In Anatolia, devotion took an even darker turn. Cybele, the Great Mother, demanded transformation. Her rituals shattered identity. Pain was proof of loyalty. Endurance was holiness. Rome imported her worship, then feared it. Cybele's cult blurred devotion and destruction. Once inside, there was no return to normal life. The self was surrendered completely. Rome allowed the cult, but only under strict control, because even Rome feared what absolute belief could do. Different goddesses, different cultures, same truth. When holiness justifies silence, power thrives, victims vanish. We celebrate gods, we study architecture, we quote philosophers, but we avoid the quiet spaces where fear lived. Because facing it means admitting that civilization was not only built by reason, but by obedience enforced through belief. In the next part, we move east and south, to Egypt and the Levant, where divine intimacy became royal policy, and where sacred bloodlines justified absolute control. Because when gods walk among humans, humans pay the price. In Egypt, the gods did not remain distant. They ruled, they married, they produced heirs, and when divinity lived in flesh, obedience became law. Here, belief was not abstract. It stood on thrones, it issued commands, and it demanded silence. Isis was everything. She gave life, she restored the dead, she legitimized kings. To rule Egypt, one needed her blessing, and that blessing was controlled, not by heaven, but by temples. Egyptian royalty claimed divine descent. Pharaohs were gods, queens were goddesses. Marriage within bloodlines preserved holiness. Refusal was unthinkable. Desire was irrelevant. Duty was absolute. Queens embodied Isis on earth. Their bodies symbolized continuity, stability, cosmic order. What they felt was never recorded. What they represented was everything. Temple rituals were not optional. They were destiny. The body became symbol. The mind became irrelevant. And history calls this harmony. Beyond Egypt, devotion hardened. Astarte, Anat, Asherah. These goddesses were not gentle mothers. They were survival itself. And survival demands sacrifice. Kings claimed divine favor through ritual union, not romance, not devotion. Authority. If the goddess chose the king, the people obeyed. Texts list offerings, dates, outcomes. They never asked consent, because consent was not part of the world. Across Egypt and the Levant, one truth remains. Holiness protected authority, not people. Gods did not demand obedience. Their interpreters did. Because these systems worked, they stabilized rule, they justified hierarchy, they made resistance sinful, and sin was worse than death. From Mesopotamia to Greece, from Rome to Egypt, the shape is clear. Sacred intimacy became political control. Ritual became obligation. Silence became survival. In the next part, we face the collapse, when new religions exposed these practices, and the temples fought back. Because when belief is threatened, Power never releases its grip quietly. No system built on fear lasts forever. Empires fall, gods are questioned, and rituals once whispered become rumors of shame. By the final centuries of the ancient world, temple power faced something it had never known: resistance, not from armies, but from doubt. Philosophers questioned divine authority. Mystery cults promised personal salvation. New religions spoke of morality beyond ritual. For the first time, holiness was separated from obedience, and the temples felt it. Temple authorities responded the only way they knew how. They tightened rules, reinforced silence, punished deviation. Because when belief wavers, authority turns cruel. As old practices became embarrassing, they were rewritten. Rituals became metaphors. Victims became symbols. Silence became tradition. History was cleaned, not corrected. When Christianity rose, Rome changed masks. Temples closed. Statues fell. Priesthoods dissolved. But power did not disappear. It migrated. The rituals were denounced. The language was condemned, but the hierarchy remained. Control of bodies shifted from goddess to doctrine. Women once dedicated to temples vanished from records, not liberated, not redeemed, forgotten, because remembering them would raise questions. No institution wanted, asked, because this history complicates comfort. It forces us to admit that morality evolves, but power adapts, and those without voices are always written out first. We tell ourselves humanity improved, but improvement is uneven, selective, fragile. Every age finds a sacred reason to demand silence. By the end of antiquity, the temples were ruins, but their logic survived. Holiness, obedience, control. Only the names changed. The gods fell, the rituals faded, the stories softened, but the silence remained. In the final part, we confront what this history leaves us with, and why remembering matters more than ever. Because buried histories do not die, they wait. History loves monuments, names carved in stone, kings, gods, victors, but it rarely remembers the quiet ones, those who endured rather than ruled, those whose obedience was mistaken for devotion, those whose silence was mistaken for consent. The temple systems collapsed, but the people shaped by them did not vanish. They lived, they aged, they carried memory without language, and history never asked what remained. When belief governs the body, the damage is not only physical, it reshapes identity. Temple systems trained people to disconnect from themselves, to obey without questioning, to survive without remembering. Generations inherited silence. These histories were not lost by accident. They were inconvenient. They challenged the idea that the past was noble. They complicated religion, empire, and morality. They revealed that civilization demanded sacrifices, not only in blood, but in autonomy. So the stories were softened, then summarized, then ignored. Myth is easier than truth. Myth gives meaning. Truth demands accountability. Calling suffering sacred is one of humanity's oldest defenses. It allows power to sleep at night. Because the mechanism never disappeared, only the language changed. Whenever authority claims moral superiority, whenever obedience is framed as virtue, whenever questioning is called betrayal, we are seeing an ancient system at work. Every age has declared something necessary for the gods, for stability, for order, and every age has asked certain people to pay the price quietly. We were taught about temples, architecture, rituals. We were not taught about aftermath, because empathy destabilizes myths. This is not a story about evil gods. It is a story about humans using belief to command obedience. The danger was never divinity, it was certainty. Even without words, their presence lingers. In the ruins, in the gaps of records, in the questions history avoids. Silence is not absence. We excavate cities, we restore temples, we celebrate gods, but the most important excavation is moral. What we choose to remember defines what we allow to repeat. When sex was declared holy, power became untouchable, and those who suffered were told their silence was sacred. History recorded the gods, but it forgot the humans. Like, comment, and subscribe to Boring Histories channel, because some histories refuse to stay buried.